Hello, and thank you for watching DC Statehood Today, the show that keeps you informed on the latest DC Statehood news. I'm your host, Camille Edwards. You can watch us online at dctv.org or dc51.us. You can also follow us on Twitter at DC51Today. H.R. 51, the Washington, D.C. Admission Act, was introduced in the 116th Congress by Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton earlier this year. H.R. 51 is proposed legislation that will make Washington, D.C. the 51st state in the Union. Norton introduced H.R. 51 in the 116th Congress with a record 155 original co-sponsors. The bill currently has 203 co-sponsors. S-631, a companion bill that was introduced in the U.S. Senate by Senator Tom Carper, currently has 32 co-sponsors. DNC Chair Tom Perez and gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams were among those who spoke at the Democratic National Committee 2019 annual winter meeting that took place in D.C. in the month of February. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser gave opening remarks, and many D.C. statehood advocates took the opportunity to push for D.C. statehood. On February 27th, volunteers from the D.C. metro area participated in the annual Statehood Capitol Hill Day. Hundreds of volunteers gathered to educate new senators and House members and their staff on why D.C. residents deserve the same rights of democracy as all other residents in all the states. Whether introducing them to the unfair strictures of home rule, the need for voting rights for D.C., or the strategic path to statehood, their voices were heard. Delegate Gabriel A. Severo introduced a resolution in the General Assembly that would declare Maryland's support of statehood for the District of Columbia. This resolution is about reaffirming Maryland's commitment to the fundamental principles undergirding American democracy, A. Severo said in a press release. It is unconscionable to me that residents in our nation's capital are obligated to pay federal taxes, adhere to federal laws, and fight and die in our country's wars, yet have no voting representation in the Congress that imposes those taxes, passes those laws, and declares those wars. The 3-page resolution was introduced to the Maryland State Assembly's House Rules and Executive Nominations Committee on February 25th. The resolution is the latest in a push by Democrats to recognize the District of Columbia as the country's 51st state. House Democrats officially passed their massive anti-corruption and pro-democracy reform bill known as H.R. 1. The bill passed on a final vote of 234 to 193. The sweeping bill is aimed at getting money out of politics and increasing transparency around donors, cracking down on lobbying, and expanding voting rights for Americans by implementing provisions like automatic voter registration. H.R. 1 also includes a provision that endorses full congressional voting rights and self-government for the District of Columbia, marking the first time a chamber of Congress has endorsed D.C. statehood. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said D.C. statehood was among the top 3 priorities for strengthening voting rights across the country. Emancipation Day is a holiday in Washington, D.C. that marks the anniversary of the signing of the Compensated Emancipation Act, which President Abraham Lincoln signed on April 16, 1862. Mayor Bowser, along with community organizations and administration officials, marched in the D.C. Emancipation Day Parade to increase awareness around the district's progress in advancing civil rights and achieving full democracy through statehood. D.C. celebrated Emancipation Day with a parade along Pennsylvania Avenue and a free concert at Freedom Plaza. The concert featured performers like Faith Evans, Kenny Lattimore, and Master G of the Sugar Hill Gang. Support for D.C. statehood continues to gain national attention and support from Americans around the country. At an event at Grandview University in March, we heard from Representative Akil Abdul Samad, Tamira Harrison, founder of Iowans for D.C. Statehood, and special guest, D.C. Senator Paul Strauss, discussed the struggles D.C. residents face, why this is long overdue, and how Iowans can make a difference. Iowans for D.C. Statehood is an advocacy group that was created to endorse and encourage citizens and members of Congress to support statehood and full democracy for the District of Columbia. The first film festival promoting D.C. statehood takes place on May 24, 2019. The film festival is organized by civil rights attorney and statehood activist Johnny Barnes Esquire and moderated by D.C. Shadow Representative Franklin Garcia. A total of $2,500 is awarded to winners at the festival. The idea of the festival is to promote D.C. statehood through short films of 5 minutes or less that explain and or promote DC statehood. Now, stay tuned for our interview segment. Here are several individuals making great strides in the DC statehood.
Welcome to this segment of the DC Statehood Today show. My name is Franklin Garcia. And today we have with us in the studio U.S. Senator Paul Strauss. Welcome to the studio, Senator Strauss.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. Yeah, so tell us a little bit about, we know that there's a lot of momentum going on right now for DC Statehood, and you're responsible for much of it. Tell us what's going on. What are you doing?
Well, we've come a long way. I think DC Statehood is now a mainstream Democratic issue on the left when it used to be considered more of a narrow one. In particular, what you're seeing is the presidential candidates, as part of the national campaigns, are being asked about it more and more as they go on the trail. And that's not just when they're here in D.C. You go to places like Iowa, and you continue to see candidates being asked by residents of Iowa to take a position on D.C. statehood. They see it as a voter suppression issue, they see it as a national issue, and they see it as a important issue. And that's real progress for us.
And you recently went to Canada to talk about DC statehood. Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I accepted an invitation by the Canadian International Affairs Council, which is foreign policy experts in our neighbor to the north. And they had a lot of questions, not just about DC statehood, but, trying to make sense of America's evolving and harder and harder to understand foreign policy in the first place because of this administration. But it was a very lively discussion. They were actually very knowledgeable about U.S. issues generally. And of course, as with people around the world, they're shocked to learn that in the District of Columbia, we don't have the same democratic rights that every other American citizen has. And so these international visits are important because, a lot of people feel strongly that we got the right to vote for president through the 23rd Amendment, largely because of international pressure. It looks bad for the United States to be violating the rights of its own citizens. It looks bad to our neighbors at home. It looks bad to our European allies. And one of the things we have to do in the statehood movement is keep up the pressure locally here in town, because Congress is here. Keep up the pressure nationally as we go around to targeted states and get our word out. And continue to outreach internationally, because the United States has signed legally binding treaties and documents that require it to provide equal suffrage, equal voting rights to all of their citizens. And when the United States is breaking that treaty, they're essentially violating international law. And we call out, as Americans, other countries for violating human rights and international law. And other countries have a legitimate right to question us when it comes to the lack of equality for D.C. and the need for D.C. statehood.
Talking about the international front, talk a little bit about how you got us membership into the UNPO, the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organizations.
The UNPO is a well-recognized group. It was founded at the Peace Palace in The Hague almost 30 years ago. And it's composed of members like Taiwan, Tibet, people who are essentially states, but they lack equal representation within the international community, be it the United Nations or within their own governments. And so I had become familiar with a lot of the good work they've done in troubled areas around the world. Nagaland in India's northeast states. They were working with a man named Biram Dahabid, who was a Mauritanian abolitionist fighting slavery. And as I began to look at the group that had worked mostly in sort of trouble spots in the world, it just began to occur to me that, we meet the criteria. We're unrepresented. We're a distinct people with our own territory, obviously. And we're committed to nonviolence change. So it was a little unusual. We had to formally have a resolution to renounce terrorism as a means of achieving our statehood struggle. And so I think that raised a few eyebrows here. But it puts us in good company with people who are using democratic, nonviolent means to try and achieve equality around the world. And it's odd because you have folks in many ways that face far greater human rights violations than we do. In East Turkestan, the Uyghur community, is over 1 million of them are now in these detention camps because they're not allowed to practice their religious freedom. Taiwan's a de facto state, but it's denied full membership in the United Nations. And when you have groups like in Kurdistan where, they were gassed by Saddam Hussein and they're at the mercy of so many other insurgent violent elements, it seems kind of odd to be in these panels where you're talking about these horrific violations of human rights and we get into our political disagreement. But international law has to be followed and it has to be respected. And so just as we enforce the law universally in civil society, I mean, you have horrible crimes being committed, murders, felonies, and so forth, but you don't ignore the misdemeanors as well. You still prosecute people for breaking the law, even in lesser crimes. And international law has to be enforced universally. And by making D.C. statehood a human rights issue, the UNPO membership gives us some credibility as well as exposure to some of these important causes. One of the best things about it is not only are they helping D.C., but that we get to play a role fighting and working on behalf of some folks who are suffering some horrible violations. In Mauritania, the Haratine are still literally in fighting to abolish slavery, where people are still owned as property and chattel. And as we've celebrated our Emancipation Day, we have to remember that there are still people who are not free around the world. And so it's been a positive thing for DC's attention in the international community. And I hope they value the contribution of DC as a member. We've tried to provide guidance, leadership, and assist where we could.
And something else that I wanted you to talk about is I know that you're getting a lot of celebrities also to join the Statehood movement through your 51 Star program. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
The 51 Stars is a great initiative that we have. One, it gets so much attention because we're talking about some of our biggest celebrities. In theory, it's really simple. We take 51 stars, the Hollywood type, to help advocate for statehood and eventually help us get 51 stars on the American flag. And that's the kind of creative ideas that you get when you work with creative people. And so we've had folks, some of them have strong ties to the district. Dave Chappelle, really a homegrown talent who made it a point to do a spot when he was here, actually donating his own hard-won Emmy to the Ellington School for the Arts. But also folks that you may not realize or associate with the district so readily, like Jonathan Banks, the star of Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, and so many movies, one of the great character actors of our time. He was born in D.C., and he does this spot where he talks about how, boy, things have changed a lot since he was a kid here. He used to go see the Senators at the old Griffith Stadium and rode in the old horse-drawn streetcars, and it just as different as the city is, the universal theme of disenfranchisement continuing on despite all of the changes in his hometown. And, we've got Rosario Dawson, we've got Wendy McClendon-Covey from the Goldbergs, just a hilarious comedic actress, Mario Van Peebles, so many stars, and we continue to attract more of them. And it's getting us a lot of attention, but it's sure a heck of a lot of fun to be around so many great personalities.
Well, let me tell you, you may not have a vote in the Senate, but you certainly have a voice that is working on behalf of the citizens of the District of Columbia. And so we appreciate all the work that you're doing on behalf of statehood and the residents of our city. That's all the time we have. I know that we can spend a lot more time talking about all the work that you're doing. So thank you so much, Senator, for coming to visit.
No, thank you, and thanks for doing this show. It's an important part of our outreach message. Great working with you as well.
Thank you for watching. This has been the segment of the DC Statehood Today show, and my guest has been U.S. Senator Paul Strauss. Stay tuned.
In 1917, while working for a printing firm on a flag book for the 48 states, Charles A.R. Dunn noticed there was no flag for his D.C. home. In 1921, he sketched a design using George Washington's coat of arms with 3 red stars above 2 red stripes on a white field. By 1924, there was considerable agitation for a D.C. flag, so the Evening Star printed Dunn's drawings. The Fine Arts Commission weighed in, saying a DC flag must emphasize that DC is the seat of the central government of all states. Dr. William Tyndall of the DC government pointed out that 3 stars could be said to represent the 3 federal branches. In June 1938, a flag commission was created by Act of Congress to advise the Commission of Fine Arts. The Heraldic Division of the War Department laid down the rules, and Mr. Dunn submitted his design. In October, a joint meeting of the 2 commissions chose Dunn's design. Along with the U.S. flag, DC could now fly their flag along with the other 48.
Welcome to the DC Statehood Today show. My name is Franklin Garcia, and today we have with us in the studio the chairman of the DC Council, Phil Mendelson. Welcome to the studio.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Frank.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's always to be with you. I know you have a very extensive legislative career. Any memorable moments that you have on the council that you say now, today you say, thank God I was part of that, and I helped make that happen?
I had a hunch you were going to ask that question. I would point to marriage equality legislation that I shepherded through the council in 2010, at a time when there were fewer than a half dozen states that had adopted similar laws. And given that Congress can easily interfere in our business, I'm very proud that we were able to get that through. Having an elected Attorney General, which I think has made a big difference for citizens in the district in terms of issues important to them. Since the Attorney General is elected, he, or at some point it could be a she, is going to be more sensitive to the electorate than what we'd seen with appointed Attorney Generals in the past. So that's made a difference in terms of advocacy on behalf of citizens.
Great, great. And a few days ago, President Trump addressed the NRA. What are we doing in our city to ensure that illegal guns don't end up in our streets?
Well, just where you start with the question, I think it's unfortunate that the president has been as pro-gun as he has been. There's no question in my mind, but regulation of firearms is critical to public safety. We've learned that we can't prohibit guns, as in the kind of ban on handguns that we had, but we have a very rigid registration process, not so rigid that a person who's law-abiding can't register a firearm. I think we have to have gun control. Because I chaired our Judiciary Committee at the time that the Heller case came down from the Supreme Court, I was the one who was the point person for rewriting our gun laws. I'm proud of those laws because we improved on our registration process and everything we can do to ensure that only those who are responsible can legally possess firearms in the district. But to go further, which needs to be done, requires federal action, because the problem that we have in the district is interstate, guns that are being brought into the district. There are limitations on the ATF's ability to deal with people suspected of having illegal guns. These are Republican amendments that were adopted years ago by Congress. I want to emphasize by Congress. And these limitations on ATF and these limitations on dealing with interstate commerce are the reason why guns illegally come into the district and are used illegally.
Great, great. Now you, along with Mayor Bowser, co-chair the New Columbia Commission on Statehood, you've seen a lot of progress. In both houses, our statehood bills have record number of co-sponsors. We are almost making statehood a household name here locally. Nationally, we hear the name, we hear statehood, and even internationally. What did you attribute the success or the momentum, if we want to call it that, right now for statehood?
I think we have been better as a city at advocating for statehood, but I also think nationally that there's such frustration with the reactionary politics that we're seeing coming from the White House and the Congress, more particularly the previous Congress, that I think that there's much more energy around what are perceived as liberal causes, like statehood. Now, I say perceived because I think statehood is a fundamental issue, and it's a fundamental issue about democratic rights. Democratic rights. And that's as old and as liberal or conservative as our founding fathers. But there's new energy around that.
And of course, we can never have enough people working for statehood.
Yes.
So how do we get more residents involved in DC statehood?
Well, one of the things that's always frustrated me with regard to the statehood efforts in the city is that too much of the conversation and energy is devoted or directed inward. Well, we can argue with each other over exactly how to proceed with statehood, what should the name be, and things like that. Or we could focus more outward, and that's what needs to happen. And outward means that for everybody, think about who you know that's not in the city and talk to them. I was talking to somebody from Arizona just yesterday and was reminded that they had the notion that Congress appropriates our dollars. No, appropriates their dollars for us. No, they don't. It's our money. It's money raised by our taxes. These are not federal dollars. So there's that kind of misunderstanding, and it was an opportunity for me to talk to these people from Arizona about DC statehood. I think too often we overlook that when we're talking to somebody from outside the state, outside the district, that we should put a plug in. The more we talk to other folks about statehood, the more people will understand and the more people will be sympathetic and argue for statehood. Years ago there was a poll done, and it found that most people did not understand that we collect our own taxes and that we don't have the same rights that they have. And when put that way, most people, according to this poll, support full citizenship for DC citizens, and that means statehood.
And I guess the last final question I have is, how do we, one of the challenges a lot of the activists we have is making people understand the relevance of statehood for them. How do we do that? What would be something that we perhaps could make them understand so that they can get more engaged in the fight for statehood?
Well, I think unfortunately the issue is nuanced, and therefore it doesn't lend itself to a simple message that would convey with power the value of statehood. I think we get it in the district because we just know that we're not being treated equally. But the way it makes a difference is, for example, complete authority over our laws. So I was talking with somebody just an hour ago about marijuana regulation. We can't regulate marijuana in the district even though it's legal because of a congressional rider. Statehood would prevent that.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Chairman Mendelson.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. This has been the segment of DC Statehood. My guest has been Chairman of the DC Council, Phil Mendelson. Stay tuned. Statehood Today show. My name is Franklin Garcia, and today we have with us in the studio Councilmember from Ward 1, Brianne Nadeau. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you, Franklin. So great to be here.
Oh, absolutely. It's always a pleasure seeing you.
You too.
So tell us a little bit about yourself so that people who are watching the show know that you've been around doing work for a little bit longer than you have been in the council.
Yeah, so I'm now the Ward 1 council member. I've been in the district about 17 years now. And when I moved here, I was working in the nonprofit world, but really got engaged in local politics and government from the ground up. I was on the neighborhood watch and doing neighborhood cleanup, and then ran for ANC and served there in ANC 1B for several years before I took a break from that and finally decided to run for council. So I really love working here in the Wilson Building and out in the ward for my constituents.
So tell us a little bit about that work that you're doing here at the DC Council and some of the legislation that you've championed.
Absolutely. Well, my big focus has been on affordable housing, on education, and then supporting our neighborhoods. So putting more than 500 units of affordable housing in the pipeline right in Ward 1, investing hundreds of millions of dollars into our schools, and then also investing in our small businesses in the corridors by creating Main Street programs that support our longtime businesses and also bring new ones in, and clean team programs that help create jobs for our returning citizens.
Oh, great, great.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk a little bit about this concept of a sanctuary city.
Sure.
I know that a lot of your residents, your constituents, are, some of them are immigrants.
Yes.
And so why is it important that DC be a sanctuary city, for example?
Well, it's really important to me as someone who represents a large immigrant community that we are supporting our immigrants and also making sure they feel safe in the community that they live in. So whether that's ensuring that they have access to our healthcare program, the Alliance, and then it's not overly cumbersome for them to renew their benefit. Some legislation that I passed would help with that. Or also making them feel safe in their own communities so that they know if they have an issue, they can call a government agency and get help rather than being at risk of being involved with the federal government. And, you know, I know that even though we are a sanctuary city and our government doesn't officially cooperate with ICE, we're still hearing stories, and so it's really important to me that we get to the bottom of any instance where someone thinks that there's been cooperation with ICE in our community.
Thank you for telling us about
Yeah.
that. Now, let's shift to DC Statehood.
Sure.
I'm sure you've seen some success. Both of our statehood bills in Congress have record number of co-sponsors.
That's right.
We have presidential candidates that are on the road talking about DC Statehood because people are asking the questions.
Right.
And of course, locally, we have a lot of people talking about DC Statehood. What do you attribute the success? We're not where we should be, obviously.
Right.
But why do you think we're getting to have so much momentum at this point?
Well, you know, you and other members of our statehood delegation have certainly worked tirelessly to raise this issue. I think council members like me have brought the issue up with our colleagues across the country, different state legislators, raising this issue at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And the mayor has also invested in outreach across the country in different target states, and I think it helps. You know, I think we could certainly be more coordinated, I think, in our efforts still. But we're making progress, and my hope is that when we do have both houses and the presidency back, that we can get this done once and for all.
All right, so how do we get more people involved in the fight for DC Statehood?
Well, it really is all about the work that you know well because you're doing so much of it, the education outward towards people living in other states. So whether those are our family members who care about our autonomy and our rights, or visitors who really see the injustice. I always joke about the work that I'm doing at home with my own guests. When I have people come from out of town, my guest room has statehood propaganda all over it, which people find interesting. I mean, it really is all about education. A lot of folks across the country don't realize that DC isn't a state that doesn't have the full rights of states. And when they do, of course, they realize it's an injustice. So the first step is really that broader education across the country, because those are the people who are going to influence the members of Congress that will ultimately vote on this legislation.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Councilmember Nadeau.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us today. This has been the segment of DC Statehood Today, and my guest has been Ward 1 Councilmember Brianne Nadeau. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching us. Remember, you can watch us online at dctv.org or dc51.us. And you can also follow us on Twitter at DC51Today. I am Camille Edwards, and we hope to see you next time on DC Statehood Today.